The air was cold and damp as the humans slowly opened their eyes. Their head ached, and their body felt heavy, as though they had been lying on the cold stone floor for days. The faint, echoing sounds of growls and movement filled the air, but when they tried to sit up, they were met with sharp pain in their ribs. The room was dark, and the only light came from a faint glow in the distance. Confusion flooded their mind. Where was they? How had they ended up here? The last thing they remembered was nothing. A black void. The human wiped their brow, trying to make sense of the situation. They were in some kind of dungeon, an endless maze of stone walls, with no doors or windows in sight. The only way out was forward, through the twisting corridors filled with danger. The human forced themselves to their feet, their legs shaky beneath them. Every instinct told them to run, but they knew there was nowhere to run. The dungeon was alive, and every part of it seemed to be watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, a noise came from the darkness ahead. A growl, low and menacing. The human froze. They weren't alone. From the shadows, a monstrous creature emerged, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. It was huge, covered in thick scales, with sharp claws that scraped against the stone floor. The human's heart raced as the creature sniffed the air, its attention focused solely on them. Without thinking, the human grabbed a jagged stone from the ground and hurled it at the creature. It missed, but the creature hesitated for a moment, just enough time for the human to dart to the side. The creature roared in anger and charged, its claws slashing through the air. The human's mind raced. They didn't have time to think. They had to move. The creature was fast, but they were faster. They ducked just in time as the creature's claws narrowly missed them. The humans scrambled to their feet, adrenaline pumping through their veins. Their eyes scanned the room for anything they could use to fight back. Then they saw an ancient-looking sword embedded in the wall. The human didn't hesitate. They lunged forward, grabbing the hilt and pulling it free. The creature turned toward them, its massive form blocking the only way out. But the human wasn't going to let this beast stop them. With one swift motion, the human swung the sword. It met the creature's scales with a loud clash, but the sword didn't break. Instead, it slid across the creature's tough skin, leaving a deep gash. The creature howled in pain, stumbling back. The human didn't stop. They struck again, this time aiming for the creature's neck. The beast fell to the ground with a heavy thud. The human stood over it, breathing heavily. For a moment, everything was silent. The creature was dead, but the victory felt hollow. This dungeon was just beginning to reveal its true nature. The human wiped the sweat from their brow, looking around. There was no sign of escape, no door, no window, just endless stone walls. But something deep inside them told them they couldn't stop now. They were the last hope of humanity. They had to keep going. They moved deeper into the dungeon. The air grew thicker, the shadows darker. Each turn brought new dangers, more creatures, more traps. But the human was determined. With every battle they fought, they felt themselves growing stronger, learning the dungeon's secrets, one challenge at a time. Days passed, or maybe weeks. It was hard to tell. The human had no way of measuring time. The only thing they knew was that they couldn't stop. They had to keep moving forward. There were whispers in the darkness, strange voices that echoed in their mind, urging them to turn back. But they refused. They had a mission. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the human came to a massive chamber. The walls were covered in ancient symbols, glowing faintly with an eerie light. At the center of the room stood a massive stone pedestal, and on top of it, the human knew instantly what it was, the key to the dungeon's exit. But as they approached the pedestal, something changed. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. A low, rumbling voice echoed through the chamber, shaking the human to their core. "You should have never come here," the voice boomed. "This place is not meant for you. You are nothing but a pawn in a game far beyond your understanding." The human didn't back down. They had come this far, and they wouldn't stop now. They reached for the crystal, but as their fingers touched it, a blinding flash filled the room, and the human's vision blurred. When the light faded, the human found themselves standing at the edge of a vast, desolate wasteland. The dungeon was gone, but the crystal remained, glowing brightly in their hand. They'd escaped, but at what cost? The wasteland stretched out before them, empty and silent. Suddenly, the human understood. The dungeon had been just a test, a trial to see if they were worthy. And now, they were the last hope of humanity, not just for survival, but for the future of the entire galaxy. The weight of the crystal in their hand felt heavier than ever. The real fight was only just beginning. In the depths of the dungeon, where the air was thick and the walls seemed to close in, a human woke up alone. They had no memory of how they got there, no idea of what was happening. The world around them was silent, except for the distant echoes of something moving, something lurking in the shadows. The human tried to sit up, but their body ached, and every movement felt like a struggle. The stone floor beneath them was cold and unforgiving. They took a deep breath and pushed through the pain. The first thing they noticed was the silence. It was so deep, so complete, that it felt like the dungeon was holding its breath. They stood, their legs trembling beneath them. The walls around them were smooth, featureless stone, stretching endlessly in every direction. There were no doors, no windows, no way to know which way to go. The only sound was the faint drip of water from somewhere far away. The human's heart raced as they started to move, cautiously at first, unsure of what awaited them. But something in their gut told them they had to keep going. There was no time to waste. Every instinct screamed that they had to survive. Minutes passed. Then hours. With each step, the human became more aware of the fact that they weren't alone. There were eyes watching them from the dark corners of the dungeon, eyes that followed their every move. The human felt the feeling that something was waiting, something lurking just beyond the edge of their sight. Suddenly, a noise. A soft scrape of claws against stone. The human froze. A low growl echoed through the air. The creature was close, too close. Without thinking, the humans spun around, ready to defend themselves, but the darkness made it impossible to see. They reached out, feeling the walls, their senses sharp. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of footsteps. The human moved quickly, silently, pressing themselves against the cold wall. They held their breath, trying to remain invisible. The creature's steps grew louder, and soon it passed right by them, unaware of their presence. The human exhaled slowly, their heart pounding in their chest. They didn't have much time. The creature would return. The human continued down the dark corridor, the silence heavy around them. Each step was careful, deliberate, as they listened for any sign of danger. They knew they were not alone in this place. Something was hunting them, and they had to be ready for whatever came next. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to shift as they walked. It was as if the dungeon itself was alive and watching. The human felt a sense of urgency. Time was running out. They had to find a way out before it was too late. And then they saw the end of the corridor. A faint light flickered. The human's heart skipped a beat. Was it real? Or was it another trap set by the dungeon? They didn't care. They had to see it for themselves. With every step they took, the light grew brighter, and soon they were standing in front of a large, open chamber. In the center of the room, a group of creatures gathered, their glowing eyes fixed on the human. There were 6 of them, massive, hulking beasts covered in thick, scaly armor. They growled and snarled, their claws clicking against the stone floor as they circled, waiting for the human to make a move. The human took a deep breath. They had to fight. There was no other choice. The creatures were too close now, and there was no way to escape without a fight. The human's hand went to the hilt of the sword at their side, a sword that had been there, always, but they had never known how it arrived in their hands. The first creature lunged. Its claws flashed through the air, but the human was faster. In one fluid motion, they drew the sword, slashing it across the creature's chest. The creature let out a roar of pain but kept coming. The human didn't hesitate. They moved like a shadow, swift and silent, cutting through the air with precision. The other creatures charged, but the human was already moving again, their blade flashing through the darkness. Each strike was quick, calculated, and deadly. The creatures fell one by one, unable to keep up with the human skill and speed. But then, the last creature stepped forward, a larger one, its eyes filled with malice. It was different from the others. Stronger. Smarter. It roared in fury, its claws glowing with dark energy. The human's grip tightened on the sword. This would be the hardest fight yet. The creature charged, but the human stood their ground, waiting for the right moment. The battle was fierce. The human dodged and weaved, narrowly avoiding the creature's deadly strikes. It seemed impossible to defeat, but the human refused to give up. With one final well-placed strike, they plunged the sword into the creature's heart. It fell to the ground with a heavy thud, lifeless. The silence returned. The humans stood over the fallen beast, breathing heavily, their bodies sore from the battle. But they didn't feel relief. Not yet. Something had changed. The dungeon was not just a prison, it was a test. And the human had passed. They had survived. But the silence wasn't over. There was more to this dungeon than just creatures. The human could feel it. Something bigger was coming. Something far more dangerous. The real challenge had only just begun. The human awoke to darkness. They didn't know where they were or how they had gotten there. The air was cold and damp, and the ground beneath them was rough and uneven. It smelled like old stone and decay. Slowly, they tried to move, their bodies stiff and aching, but they were disoriented. They had no memory of anything before this moment. When they tried to stand, they stumbled, but their feet finally found solid ground. Panic began to rise in their chests. The only sound was the faint echo of their breathing, and the deeper they listened, the more they realized the silence felt unnatural. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. The humans swallowed hard, forcing their heart to calm. They had to focus. They couldn't afford to panic. Slowly, their senses sharpened. There were no windows, no doors, just a wide, dark expanse ahead. But in the distance, barely visible through the shadows, they saw a faint light flickering. It was their only hope. They began walking toward the light, each step cautious, the silence growing heavier with every movement. The darkness seemed to stretch endlessly, and the deeper they ventured, the more the air seemed to grow thicker, pressing against them like something alive. The human reached out, brushing their hand against the cold stone walls. They could feel something strange under their fingertip, symbols, ancient and worn, etched into the surface. They were unfamiliar, but they sent a shiver down their spine. Something wasn't right. Something was watching them. The distant flicker of light grew brighter, pulling them forward. They didn't know what awaited them, but they knew one thing for sure: they couldn't stay here. Whatever this place was, it wasn't meant for them. The light grew clearer, and the human picked up their pace, their heartbeat quickening. Then, suddenly, the sound of a growl shattered the silence. A low, rumbling noise that came from the darkness just behind them. The human froze. They weren't alone. From the shadows, a creature appeared. Its eyes gleamed in the dark, glowing red, and its massive form towered over the human. It moved slowly, deliberately, its claws scraping against the stone floor. The creature was huge, far too big for the human to fight head-on. They needed to escape. There was no other choice. Without thinking, the human ran. They sprinted as fast as they could, the sound of the creature's pursuit echoing behind them. Their breath came in short gasps as their feet pounded against the ground. The light grew closer, and the human pushed themselves harder, ignoring the pain in their muscles. But the creature was fast, too fast. They could hear its heavy footsteps, the growls growing louder. It was getting closer. The human's chest tightened, and for a moment, fear gripped them. They couldn't outrun it forever. Just as the creature's claws scraped the back of their heel, the human reached the light. It was a door, an ancient wooden door, cracked and old, but it was open. They didn't hesitate. With one desperate push, the human shoved through the door, tumbling into the next room. The door slammed shut behind them, and for a moment, everything was silent again. The human lay on the cold stone floor, their chest heaving. They were safe, for now. But their relief was short-lived. The room was unlike any they had seen before. The walls were lined with strange carvings, and a large stone pedestal stood in the center, glowing with an eerie light dot at the pedestal's base. A large, dark hole opened in the floor, leading deep into the earth. It looked like an abyss, endless, dark, and cold. The human took a step forward, feeling an unnatural pull toward it. They didn't know why, but something about the hole drew them in, as if it was calling to them. But there was no time to think. The growl of the creature echoed from behind the door. It was coming closer. Panic surged in the human's chest again. They had no choice. They had to get out of here. The abyss seemed like the only way. Without thinking, they took a deep breath and leapt toward the hole, falling into the darkness. The fall felt endless. The air rushed around them, cold and sharp, until with a sudden thud, they landed hard on a stone floor. Their body ached, but the pain was a small price for the moment of escape. They forced themselves to stand, looking around. The abyss had led them into another chamber, one even darker and more mysterious than the last. The walls were jagged and uneven, the air thick with an almost suffocating tension. There was no sign of the creature, at least, not yet. But the human knew better than to believe they were safe. They had no idea where they were or how to escape this place. All they knew was that they had to keep moving. They moved forward cautiously, their heart racing with every step. The silence in the abyss was heavy, and they could feel something lurking just out of sight. The deeper they went, the more the darkness seemed to close in around them. Then, a faint sound like whispers began to fill the air. It was almost impossible to make out, but the human could feel the weight of the voices pressing down on them. It was as if the very walls of the abyss were alive, watching, waiting. The human stopped, straining to hear. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. They weren't alone. Something was down here with them, something ancient and powerful. And it was only a matter of time before it found them. The human's pulse raced as they turned to run again. But this time, they couldn't escape. The abyss had no end. They were trapped, and the whispers were closing in. The darkness was suffocating. The human's chest tightened as they struggled to breathe, their heart pounding in their ears. They were trapped in the dungeon, and the only thing they could see was the faint outline of the walls surrounding them, closing in with every step they took. They didn't know how they had ended up here. One moment, they were on the surface, walking freely under the sky. The next, they were in this forsaken place, cold, damp, and silent. But there was something else, something worse than the darkness, the feeling of being watched. The humans stood still, trying to steady their breath. The sound of water dripping echoed through the chamber, and the cold stone under their feet sent a shiver up their spine. They couldn't stay here. They had to find a way out. A faint glimmer of light caught their eye. It was coming from the far end of the corridor, where a large door stood slightly ajar. The human's heart skipped a beat. Could it be an exit? They didn't know, but it was the only hope they had. They started to walk toward it, their steps quiet but quick. As they approached, a strange noise made them stop. A faint clicking sound, like something moving in the shadows. The human froze. Every instinct screamed at them to run, but they couldn't. If they ran, they would never find the way out. They turned slowly, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just shadows. Then, the sound came again. Closer this time. The human's pulse quickened. They could feel the presence of something unseen, something that was waiting, watching. They had to move. With a sharp breath, they pushed forward, reaching the door and forcing it open. On the other side was a small, dimly lit room. It looked like an old prison cell, with stone walls and a narrow window far above. But in the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it rested a strange, glowing key. The key shone with an eerie blue light, casting long shadows across the floor. Without thinking, the humans stepped forward. They had no idea what the key was for, but something about it called to them. It felt like the answer, like it was the key to their escape. Their fingers brushed the cool metal as they picked it up, and as soon as they touched it, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned as if they were alive, and the ground beneath the humans' feet trembled. They stumbled back, clutching the key in their hand. The door slammed shut behind them, and the room went dark. The only light came from the key, now glowing brighter than before. Suddenly, a voice deep and resonant filled the room. "Foolish human," it said. "You've taken the key, but now you must face the consequences." The human's stomach dropped. What was speaking to them? They turned, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was nothing. Only darkness. And then, the ground beneath them cracked open, a deep fissure forming in the stone. A cold wind rushed from the hole, and something began to rise from the depths below. A creature, massive and terrifying, began to emerge from the darkness. Its eyes glowed red, its claws sharp and long. It let out a low growl, and the human's heart froze. This was no ordinary beast. This was the guardian of the dungeon, and the key they held was the only way to defeat it. The human's mind raced. They had no weapon, no plan, only the key. But they couldn't afford to hesitate. They had to act. The creature roared, its massive form lunging toward the human with terrifying speed. In a panic, the human thrust the key forward, not knowing what else to do. The key glowed brighter, and with a flash of light, the creature was thrown back, slamming into the walls of the chamber. The air around them seemed to ripple, and the human could feel the dungeon itself reacting to the key. The beast recovered quickly, its red eyes burning with rage. It snarled and charged again, but this time the human held the key steady. The light grew brighter, blindingly so, and as the creature drew closer, it was repelled once more, as though the key had become a shield of light. The human didn't stop. They moved toward the pedestal, heart racing. They could feel the presence of the creature behind them, growing closer, but they kept moving. The key glowed brighter with each step, as if it were guiding them. Finally, they reached the pedestal. They had to trust it, trust the key. With a deep breath, they placed it into a slot at the center of the stone structure. The ground rumbled beneath them, and the chamber seemed to come alive. The creature let out one final, thunderous roar as the walls of the dungeon began to crack open, revealing a blinding light. The human was thrown back as the key activated, and the creature was engulfed by the light, vanishing into nothingness. The dungeon trembled and began to collapse around them. The humans scrambled to their feet, the weight of exhaustion pulling at their limbs. But they couldn't stop now. The exit was within reach. They sprinted through the collapsing dungeon, the light from the key lighting the way. The walls crumbled, and the ground shook beneath them, but the human didn't look back. They ran until they burst through the final doorway and into the open air. The key's glow faded as the dungeon collapsed behind them, leaving nothing but rubble. The humans stood in the quiet sunlight, breathing heavily, alive. They had escaped. But in the distance, the faintest shadow moved, and the human knew this was not the end. The battlefield was silent. The wind howled over the charred remains of what had once been a thriving city. Ashes floated through the air, carried by the breeze, as if the earth itself mourned the loss of life. The humans stood alone, their weapon clenched tightly in their hand, their body bruised and broken. They had fought for hours, no, for days against an enemy that seemed endless. And now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they faced their final stand. The enemy was coming. The ground trembled with the sound of marching feet, thousands, maybe more. They could hear the distant roar of the creatures, their inhuman voices filling the air like a dark song of victory. But the human refused to surrender. This was the end, but not the end they had imagined. They had never dreamed they would be the last one left, the last hope for humanity. They had always believed someone else would come, but now it was just them. And the enemy. The human gritted their teeth, their breath shallow but steady. They couldn't let fear take hold. Not now. They had one chance, one final moment to make a difference. They turned toward the line of defense that had been set up around the city, a hastily constructed wall of debris and broken vehicles. There, hidden in the shadows, were the remnants of the last resistance. But they were gone. All of them. Dead. The human had seen it. The last wave of the enemy had come through like a storm, wiping out everyone in its path. Friends, comrades, they were all gone. Only the human remained, standing between the invaders and what was left of their world. Suddenly, the first of the enemy appeared from the darkness. A towering figure, its body covered in jagged black armor that gleamed under the pale light of the moon. It was massive, far larger than any human. Its eyes glowed with an eerie red light, and it carried a weapon, some kind of spear made of dark metal, crackling with power. The humans' grip on their own weapon tightened, knowing that this was just the beginning. The humans' heart raced, but they forced themselves to focus. They had no choice. The creatures were relentless, but they had been trained, had fought before. They could do this. The first creature charged. Its footsteps were thunderous, each one shaking the ground beneath them. The human didn't wait. They moved quickly, ducking low and sprinting toward the incoming enemy. As the creature swung its spear down, the human rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the deadly strike. They countered, slashing their weapon across the creature's leg. It howled in pain but didn't stop. The human didn't have time to enjoy the small victory. The enemy was too many, and this one was only the first. Another creature appeared behind it, followed by more, until the battlefield was full of them. The human's mind raced. They couldn't win this fight. There were too many, but they couldn't give up. Not when everything depended on them. With every strike, the human's body grew heavier, their strength draining with each swing. Their weapon, once sharp and sure, now felt like a burden. They could feel the weight of the world on their shoulders. They fought to keep their breath steady, but it became harder. Their vision blurred as fatigue set in, their muscles aching from the constant battle. But they kept going. One strike. Another. Their weapon met armor, and the creatures fell, but more took their place. They were closing in. The human's back was against the broken wall now, no more room to move. This was it. This was the end. Suddenly, the ground shook again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the marching of enemies. It was something else. A low rumble, deep beneath the earth. The human looked up, their eyes wide in confusion. What was happening? The creatures paused, sensing the change in the air. For a moment, there was silence, then a blinding light burst from the center of the battlefield. A massive crack in the ground opened wide, sending shockwaves through the earth. The humans stumbled backward, their weapon falling from their hand. They couldn't see what was happening, but they could feel it. Something was emerging from the crack, a massive force, a presence like nothing the human had ever felt before. The creatures howled in fear, retreating into the shadows. But the human was frozen, unable to move. The light was so bright it was almost blinding, and the air around them felt charged with power. And then, in an instant, it was gone. The crack in the ground closed, and the light faded. The battlefield fell silent again. The human looked around, their chest heaving, their minds spinning. The creatures were gone. But what had just happened? Were they victorious? Or had they been spared for another reason? As the dust settled, the human moved cautiously forward, stepping over the bodies of the fallen enemy. They reached for their weapon again, their fingers trembling as they picked it up. But the world around them felt different. Lighter, almost. The battle was over. But what was left? In the distance, they saw something else, a figure emerging from the wreckage. It was human, just like them. The human's heart raced as they realized they were not alone. The last hope of humanity had not been extinguished after all. But who was this new figure? And were they a friend or another enemy waiting to strike? The human raised their weapon, ready for whatever came next. The battle may have ended, but the war was far from over.